February 21st, 1944, Mangkwon, northern Burma. Colonel Tanaka Shinichi of the Imperial Japanese Army's 18th Division stood at the edge of the command tent, reading the intelligence summary for the third time. The report described American soldiers, approximately 3,000 of them, moving through the Hukong Valley on foot. No vehicle support, no armor, marching directly into the jungle that had swallowed British armies whole. Tanaka allowed himself a thin smile. He turned to his adjutant, Major Hayashi Noboru, and tapped the paper with his index finger. "The Americans have sent us a gift," he said. "Infantry without artillery support, walking into our jungle. They will learn what the British learned at Singapore, what the Dutch learned in Java, what every white army learns when it faces the Chrysanthemum Division." The 18th Division needed no introduction. These were the Conquerors of Malaya, the men who had bicycled down the peninsula in 69 days, while the British Empire collapsed before them. They had stormed the impregnable fortress of Singapore and accepted the surrender of 80,000 Commonwealth troops, the largest capitulation in British military history. They had spent 2 years perfecting jungle warfare in Burma, learning every trail, every river crossing, every ambush point. No Western force had ever defeated them in close combat beneath the canopy. "They call themselves Marauders," Hayashi said, reading from a captured American document. "Volunteers, long-range penetration specialists." Tanaka almost laughed. "Long-range penetration," he repeated. "Do they understand what that means here? The disease alone will destroy them. Malaria, dysentery, scrub typhus. The jungle itself fights for Japan." He set down the report. "Let them come. In 3 weeks, we will be collecting their dog tags." What Colonel Tanaka didn't know, what no Japanese officer in Burma could have imagined, was that the ragged column moving through the Hukong Valley had been designed specifically to destroy units like his. These Americans had trained for months in jungle warfare, had studied Japanese tactics with obsessive precision, and had learned the single lesson that would prove decisive. The 18th Division had never faced an enemy willing to match them in brutality, endurance, and close quarters killing beneath the trees. Within 6 weeks, Tanaka's regiment would be shattered. Within 4 months, the Chrysanthemum Division, the Conquerors of Singapore, the pride of the Imperial Army, would suffer defeat after defeat at the hands of men they had dismissed as soft, undisciplined, and incapable of jungle war. The Americans called themselves Merrill's Marauders. The Japanese would learn to call them something else entirely. They would learn to call them the enemy that kept coming back. The Japanese confidence in Burma was not arrogance, it was mathematics. By early 1944, the Imperial Japanese Army had compiled a record in jungle warfare that no military force on Earth could match. Since December 1941, Japanese soldiers had conquered an empire stretching from the borders of India to the Solomon Islands, over 3 million square miles of territory seized in less than 6 months. They had defeated the British in Malaya and Burma, the Dutch in the East Indies, the Americans in the Philippines. Every engagement in jungle terrain had ended the same way. Western armies broken, retreating, surrendering in numbers that shocked the world. The 18th Division embodied this supremacy. Activated in 1907, it had fought in China since 1937, but Malaya had forged its legend. Under Lieutenant General Yamashita Tomoyuki, the division had advanced 650 miles in 69 days, averaging nearly 10 miles per day through terrain the British had deemed impassable. They moved on bicycles when trucks failed. They infiltrated through mangrove swamps the enemy had left unguarded. They appeared behind defensive lines that should have held for weeks, and they did it again and again until the word encirclement became synonymous with Japanese tactics. "The British believed the jungle was a barrier," wrote Captain Ogawa Masao of the 18th Division's 114th Regiment in his field diary. "We understood it was a road." Singapore had validated everything. On February 15, 1942, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival had walked into the Ford Motor Factory at Bukit Timah and surrendered 80,000 troops to a Japanese force half that size. The photograph of Percival carrying the white flag became the defining image of Western colonial collapse in Asia. The men of the 18th Division had been there. They had seen the empire fall. Now, 2 years later, those same veterans held northern Burma. They knew every disease, every parasite, every way the jungle killed men who didn't belong. They had watched British and Indian units wither under conditions that Japanese soldiers endured through discipline and spiritual preparation. The Rikugun, the imperial army, trained its men to survive on rice and rainwater, to march 30 miles through sucking mud, to fight hand-to-hand in visibility measured in feet rather than yards. Colonel Tanaka's assessment of the approaching Americans drew on this institutional knowledge. His intelligence staff had compiled detailed reports on U.S. Army performance in the Pacific, and the conclusions were damning. American soldiers depended on massive logistical support, hot food, medical evacuation, ammunition resupply. They fought well when supported by naval gunfire and air superiority, but they had never operated deep in jungle terrain without those advantages. They had never marched for weeks through unmapped wilderness. They had never faced an enemy that would die rather than retreat. The American soldier is brave but soft, read a 18th Division intelligence assessment dated January 1944. He requires constant supply and breaks under sustained hardship. He cannot match the spiritual strength of the Japanese soldier. In protracted jungle operations without resupply, American units will collapse within 2 weeks. The assessment was logical. It was supported by evidence. It was catastrophically wrong. What Japanese intelligence could not measure, what no report could capture, was that the Americans walking into the Hukong Valley had been selected precisely because they were different. They were volunteers who had chosen the worst assignment the U.S. Army could offer. They had trained for months in conditions designed to break them, and they were led by a man who understood exactly what winning in Burma would require. The mathematics was about to change. The unit that would become Merrill's Marauders was born from desperation, shaped by a British eccentric, and forged in the most unforgiving training environment the U.S. Army had ever created. In August 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill met at the Quadrant Conference in Quebec. Among the items on the agenda was a problem that had frustrated Allied planners for 18 months: Burma. The Japanese held the Burma Road, the only land supply route to nationalist China. Without that road, Chiang Kai-shek's armies would wither. Without China in the war, 1 million Japanese soldiers would be free to redeploy against American forces in the Pacific. Burma mattered, but no one knew how to take it back. Churchill had an answer, and his name was Ord Wingate. Brigadier Wingate was a gaunt, wild-eyed visionary who had already led one long-range penetration mission into Burma, Operation Longcloth, earlier that year. His Chindits had marched hundreds of miles behind Japanese lines, cutting railways and disrupting supply routes. The operation had been a tactical failure and a strategic revelation. Wingate had lost a third of his men, but he had proven that Western soldiers could survive in the Burmese jungle. More importantly, he had proven that the Japanese could be hurt. "The enemy believes the jungle belongs to him," Wingate told the combined chiefs at Quebec, his intensity unnerving even the generals. "We must disabuse him of this notion. We must meet him in his own territory and destroy him there." Roosevelt was captivated. He turned to General George Marshall and issued an order: create an American long-range penetration unit, find volunteers, send them to Burma. Show the world that American infantry could fight and win where the British Empire had been humiliated. The call went out across the Pacific and Caribbean, a classified request for volunteers willing to undertake a dangerous and hazardous mission. No details were provided. No promises were made. The grueling recruitment notice attracted exactly the type of men the mission required: soldiers bored with garrison duty, veterans hungry for combat, misfits and troublemakers who saw an unnamed dangerous mission as preferable to whatever they were currently doing. Approximately 2,900 men answered the call. They were designated the 5,307th Composite Unit Provisional, a deliberately bland name for a unit with no precedent in American military history. Their commander was Brigadier General Frank Merrill, a 40-year-old former enlisted man who had served as an intelligence officer in Burma during the 1942 retreat. Merrill had walked out of Burma with General Joseph Stilwell's headquarters staff, covering 140 miles on foot through the same jungle his men would now be asked to conquer. He knew the terrain, he knew the enemy, and he knew what his volunteers would face. "I won't lie to you," Merrill told his assembled unit at their training camp in Deoghar, India. Some of you won't come back, maybe most of you, but the men who do come back will have done something no American soldiers have ever done. You'll have beaten the Japanese at their own game, on their own ground. Training began in October 1943 and continued for 4 months under conditions designed to simulate the worst Burma could offer. The men marched 25 miles per day through Indian jungle with full packs. They learned to navigate without maps, to survive on K-rations and river water, to move silently through vegetation so thick that squads could pass within 10 feet of each other without visual contact. They practiced immediate action drills until ambush response became instinct. They fired thousands of rounds in close quarters exercises, learning to fight in the compressed distances of jungle combat where engagements happened at 30 yards or less. The Marauders were organized into 6 combat teams, each built around approximately 400 men divided into 2 combat platoons and a weapons platoon. They carried M1 Garand rifles, Browning automatic rifles, Thompson submachine guns, and 60mm mortars, weapons chosen for reliability and portability rather than firepower. Every man was cross-trained in multiple roles. Every man could navigate, call in airdrops, treat wounds, and kill at close range. There was no precedent for what they were about to attempt. American infantry doctrine emphasized combined arms, tanks, artillery, air support, massed firepower. The Marauders would have none of these. They would march into the jungle with what they could carry, fight an entrenched enemy with superior numbers, and survive on airdrops that might or might not arrive. General Stilwell, the acid-tongued commander of U.S. forces in the China-Burma-India theater, reviewed the operation plan and offered his assessment. "It's a suicide mission," he said, "but it might work." In February 1944, the 5307 Composite Unit, Provisional, crossed into Burma. The Japanese were waiting. They had no idea what was coming. The jungle began killing Marauders before the Japanese fired a single shot. Within the first week of the march into the Hukong Valley, the 5,307th lost 23 men to disease. Malaria struck first, the Plasmodium parasites carried by clouds of Anopheles mosquitoes that descended at dusk and fed through the night despite repellent, despite netting, despite every precaution the Army Medical Corps had devised. Men who had been healthy at dawn were shaking with 104-degree fevers by nightfall. Then came the dysentery, spread through water sources that looked clear but carried amoebic parasites invisible to the naked eye. Soldiers who couldn't stop their bowels from emptying still had to march. Those who couldn't march were left at collection points to await evacuation that might take days. "I've buried men who never saw a Japanese soldier," wrote Sergeant Roy Matsumoto of the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon. "The jungle doesn't care how tough you think you are." British officers attached to General Stilwell's headquarters watched the Marauders' initial progress with undisguised skepticism. Brigadier Michael Roberts of the British 36th Division had seen the Chindits return from Operation Longcloth, hollow-eyed survivors who had lost weight they couldn't spare and carried parasites that would kill them years later. "The Americans have enthusiasm," Roberts wrote in a memo to his superiors. "Enthusiasm does not survive the Burmese jungle. Within a month, they will understand what we learned at great cost. White men cannot fight effectively in this environment for extended periods." The first contact with Japanese forces seemed to confirm every pessimistic assessment. On March 3, 1944, 2nd Battalion's Orange Combat Team ran into elements of the 56th Regiment near Laganga. The engagement was supposed to be a textbook ambush, Marauders concealed along a jungle trail, waiting for a Japanese patrol to walk into the kill zone. Instead, the Japanese patrol detected the American position and melted into the undergrowth before the trap could be sprung. 20 minutes later, mortar rounds began falling on the Orange Combat Team's position from a direction no one had anticipated. The Japanese had executed a flanking maneuver through terrain the Americans had deemed impassable. 3 Marauders died in the mortar barrage. 7 more were wounded. The Japanese patrol escaped without a confirmed casualty. "They're ghosts," Private First Class Henry Goshow reported to his platoon leader after the engagement. "They're in the trees, they're in the grass, they're everywhere and nowhere. How do you fight something you can't see?" Japanese intelligence officers collected detailed reports on the engagement, and the analysis reached Colonel Tanaka within 48 hours. The verdict was dismissive. The Americans attempted a basic linear ambush and failed, the report concluded. Their noise discipline is poor. Their reaction to indirect fire is slow and disorganized. They do not understand maneuver in jungle terrain. Recommend continued harassment to accelerate their physical and psychological deterioration. The assessment was not unreasonable. Through the first 2 weeks of March, the Marauders stumbled through a series of inconclusive firefights that cost them men without delivering decisive results. Japanese patrols seemed to anticipate their movements. Supply drops missed their targets, leaving units short on ammunition and food. The terrain itself fought against them. Ravines that appeared as thin lines on maps required hours to descend and climb. Rivers that looked fordable on reconnaissance photos turned out to be chest-deep rapids choked with debris. Disease rates climbed relentlessly. By March 10th, nearly 15% of the 5,307th was suffering from malaria, dysentery, or both. Men marched with fevers that would have hospitalized them stateside. The smell of the column, unwashed bodies, infected wounds, human waste from soldiers who couldn't control their bowels, became a constant presence that new replacements would later describe as the first thing they noticed about the Marauders. "The Americans are dying on the vine," wrote Lieutenant Yamamoto Kenji of the 18th Division's Reconnaissance Company in his field diary. "We find their garbage on the trails, empty plasma containers, bloody bandages, discarded equipment. They are shedding men and materiel like a sick animal sheds hair. If we simply maintain contact and let the jungle do its work, they will cease to exist as a fighting force within 3 weeks." Stilwell received the casualty reports at his headquarters in Lido and said nothing. Merrill, still leading from the front, despite a heart condition that should have disqualified him from combat duty, pushed the column forward. There was no alternative. The mission required the Marauders to cut the road behind the 18th Division's main force, a 60-mile march through unmapped jungle to the village of Wallabum. If they couldn't reach Wallabum, the entire operation was pointless. If they reached Wallabum and couldn't fight when they arrived, they would die there. The Japanese watched them coming and waited. The trap, they believed, was already sprung. They could not have been more wrong. March 3rd to 7th, 1944, Wallabum, northern Burma. Staff Sergeant Robert Landis of Khaki Combat Team heard the Japanese before he saw them. The distinctive clink of equipment, the murmur of voices speaking in clipped syllables, the sound of hundreds of boots moving through underbrush. He pressed himself deeper into the depression behind the fallen teak log and controlled his breathing. Beside him, Private First Class James Chen slowly raised his M1 Garand and sighted down the trail. They had been in position for 11 hours, waiting. The Marauders had reached Wallabum after a punishing 5-day march through terrain that had cost them another 47 men to disease and exhaustion. They had arrived at dawn on March 3rd, moving into blocking positions across the road that served as the 18th Division's primary supply line. Now they waited for the Japanese to discover that their rear had been cut. The discovery came at 0847 on March 4th. A supply column of the 56th Regiment, approximately 800 soldiers escorting ammunition and food to the front lines, walked directly into the Marauders' kill zone. The lead element was less than 30 yards from the American positions when Lieutenant Samuel Wilson of Khaki Combat Team keyed his radio handset and spoke a single word: execute. The jungle exploded. 12 Browning automatic rifles opened fire simultaneously, their heavy .30-06 rounds shredding vegetation and flesh at 500 rounds per minute per weapon. M1 Garands added their sharp crack to the cacophony. 60mm mortars, pre-registered on the trail junction, began dropping rounds with terrible precision. The first Japanese volley killed over 60 men before they could unsling their rifles. Sergeant Landis watched a Japanese officer, a lieutenant, judging by his sword, try to organize a counterattack. The man was screaming orders, pointing toward the American positions, attempting to form his soldiers into a skirmish line. A burst from Chen's bar caught him across the chest and spun him backward into the undergrowth. He was dead before he hit the ground. The engagement lasted 23 minutes. When it ended, 187 Japanese soldiers lay dead on the trail and in the surrounding jungle. American casualties, 8 wounded, none killed. But the Battle of Wollobum was only beginning. Colonel Tanaka received word of the ambush within hours. His response was immediate and furious. He dispatched 2 full battalions, nearly 1,500 men, to eliminate the American roadblock and reopen his supply line. The counterattack began at dawn on March 5th and continued without pause for the next 72 hours. What followed shattered every assumption the Japanese held about American infantry. The Marauders did not retreat. They did not call for reinforcement. They dug into their positions and fought with a ferocity that stunned the attacking Japanese battalions. When ammunition ran low, supply planes dropped more. When Japanese flanking attempts threatened to encircle American positions, the Marauders detected them, redeployed, and turned the encirclers into the encircled. When night fell, the Americans stayed in their holes and killed Japanese soldiers who had been trained to believe that darkness belonged to them. Private First Class Henry Gasho, the same soldier who had called the Japanese ghosts after Laganga, found himself at the center of the most vicious fighting on March 6. His squad held a small knoll overlooking the main road, and the Japanese wanted that knoll desperately. They attacked 4 times in 6 hours. Each time, they came closer. Each time, the pile of bodies at the base of the American position grew larger. They kept coming, Gosho wrote in a letter he never sent. Wave after wave. I stopped counting after the second assault. My rifle was so hot I couldn't touch the barrel. I was standing in spent brass up to my ankles, and they kept coming, but we didn't move. We didn't give them 1 goddamn inch. Sergeant Roy Matsumoto, the Nisei linguist who had already proven invaluable for intercepting Japanese radio communications, performed an act of deception so audacious it would become legend. On the night of March 6th, listening to Japanese officers coordinating their next assault, Matsumoto crawled to within earshot of the enemy assembly point. As the Japanese soldiers prepared to charge, he stood up in the darkness and screamed in perfect Japanese, "Totsugeki," the command to charge. The Japanese soldiers, conditioned to obey without hesitation, leaped from their positions and rushed forward, directly into the muzzles of the waiting Marauders. The slaughter lasted less than a minute. 54 Japanese soldiers died because they followed an order given by an American. By the morning of March 7th, it was over. The Japanese battalions, having suffered over 800 casualties in 3 days of continuous assault, withdrew. The road remained cut. The 18th Division's supply line remained severed. Colonel Tanaka's after-action report, recovered after the war, revealed the impact of Wollobum on Japanese thinking. The Americans did not fight as we expected. They did not break under sustained pressure. They did not withdraw when encircled. They matched our infantry in close combat and defeated us. This was not the enemy we were told to expect. This was something else. The Conquerors of Singapore had met an opponent that refused to be conquered, and Wollobum was only the first battle. The Marauders did not rest. They could not afford to. Within days of Wollobum, General Stilwell issued new orders. March south, cut the road again, forced the 18th Division to fight on 2 fronts while Chinese forces pressed from the north. The men who had just survived 72 hours of continuous combat shouldered their packs and moved out. Many were already sick. All were exhausted. None refused. The pattern that emerged over the following weeks would drive the Japanese command to something approaching despair. Shaduzup, March 28, 1944. The 2nd Battalion caught the 114th Regiment's headquarters company in a dawn raid that killed the regimental executive officer, destroyed the communications center, and captured documents detailing the entire Japanese defensive plan for the Mogong Valley. The Marauders were gone before the reaction force arrived, melting into jungle that the Japanese had believed they controlled. In Kangatong. April 1st, 1944. 1st Battalion ambushed a resupply convoy, destroying 18 trucks loaded with artillery ammunition. The explosion was visible for miles. The 18th Division's artillery batteries went silent for 6 days. NHPM, Georgia, April 4th to 9th, 1944. The Japanese finally managed to encircle an American position. 2nd Battalion, dug in on a hilltop with dwindling supplies and mounting casualties. Colonel Tanaka personally directed the siege, committing 3 battalions to what he believed would be the Marauders' annihilation. For 5 days, Japanese forces attacked the perimeter without pause. For 5 days, the Americans held. Sergeant John Jones of Orange Combat Team later described the siege in terms that revealed what the Marauders had become. "We were out of water by day 3. We were drinking from bamboo stalks and licking moisture off leaves. Guys were fighting with malaria fevers so high they were hallucinating. We had wounded men who couldn't be evacuated, just lying in holes, waiting to see if they'd live or die. And every night the Japanese would come up that hill, and every night we'd kill them. We didn't think about winning anymore. We just thought about making them pay for every inch." The relief column, 1st and 3rd Battalions driving through Japanese lines, reached Enepumge on April 9th. They found 2nd Battalion still holding, still fighting, surrounded by Japanese dead stacked 3 deep in some sectors. The siege had cost the Marauders 57 killed and 302 wounded. The Japanese lost over 1,100 men trying to take a single hill. The mathematics Colonel Tanaka had trusted were failing him. Lieutenant Yamamoto Kenji, the reconnaissance officer who had written so confidently about Americans dying on the vine, submitted a very different report after Napumga. "The enemy does not behave as previous Western forces have behaved. They do not surrender when surrounded. They do not retreat when outnumbered. They fight like Japanese soldiers, but with more ammunition and superior medical support. Our casualties are unsustainable. Request immediate reinforcement or permission to withdraw." Permission was denied. Reinforcement was impossible. The 18th Division was being bled white by 3,000 Americans who refused to die according to schedule. The psychological transformation within the Japanese ranks became visible in captured documents and prisoner interrogations. Early reports had described the Marauders with contempt, karuiteki, light enemy, unworthy of serious concern. By mid-April, the terminology had changed. Intelligence summaries now referred to them as shitsukoi teki, persistent enemy, or simply oni, demons. Captain Ogawa Masao, whose diary had once celebrated the 18th Division's mastery of jungle warfare, wrote an entry on April 14th that captured the shifting reality. "We have been fighting the Americans for 7 weeks. In that time, we have not won a single engagement, not one. They ambush our supply columns. They appear behind our lines. They vanish when we pursue. When we trap them, they do not break. They kill us until we withdraw. I have fought the Chinese. I have fought the British. I have never faced an enemy like this. I am beginning to believe we cannot defeat them. I am beginning to believe they cannot be defeated at all." The Marauders had become what no American unit had ever been in the Pacific War, an infantry force that the Japanese genuinely feared, but still wanted more. The ultimate objective, the prize that would justify every death, every disease, every mile of suffering, was still ahead. Myitkyina, the only all-weather airfield in northern Burma, the key to the entire theater. On May 17, 1944, the Marauders would attempt the impossible, a 65-mile march through jungle so dense it wasn't on any map, followed by a surprise assault on a fortified position held by fresh Japanese troops. They were down to 1,400 effective soldiers. Over half the original force had been evacuated due to wounds or disease. The men who remained were skeletal, riddled with parasites, running on nothing but momentum and hate. They went anyway, and they took the airfield in a single day. The numbers tell a story that requires no embellishment. In 5 months of continuous combat operations, Merrill's Marauders marched over 1,000 miles through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. They fought in 5 major engagements and 32 smaller actions. They defeated Japanese forces in every significant battle: Walaubum, Shaduzup, Inkangatong, Napumga, Myitkyina. They killed an estimated 2,800 Japanese soldiers and wounded thousands more. They captured the only all-weather airfield in northern Burma, opening an air corridor to China that would sustain Chiang Kai-shek's armies through the end of the war. The cost was staggering. Of the 2,997 men who entered Burma in February 1944, only 1,310 remained by the time Myitkyina fell on August 3rd. The rest had been killed, wounded, or evacuated due to disease. At one point during the Myitkyina siege, the unit's effective strength dropped below 200 men, yet they continued to hold their positions against Japanese counterattacks. The Marauders suffered a casualty rate exceeding 93%, one of the highest of any American unit in any theater of the Second World War. Every surviving member of the 5,307th Composite Unit Provisional, received the Bronze Star. It remains the only unit in American military history to receive such a distinction. But the true measure of what the Marauders accomplished lies not in American commendations. It lies in what the Japanese themselves admitted after the guns fell silent. Colonel Tanaka Shinichi survived the war. Interrogated at a POW processing center in September 1945, he was asked to assess the various Allied forces his division had faced during 3 years of fighting in Burma. His response was recorded by Captain William Henderson of the U.S. Army Historical Section. The Chinese were numerous but poorly led. The British were brave but predictable. The Americans, the Marauders, were different from any enemy we encountered. They fought like fanatics. They endured conditions that should have destroyed them. They learned our tactics and turned them against us. At Enchpumga, we had them surrounded, outnumbered, starving. Any other Western unit would have surrendered. They killed 800 of my men instead. I do not understand how such soldiers are made. I only know that we could not break them. Major Hayashi Noboru, Tanaka's adjutant, who had once read intelligence reports dismissing the Americans as soft, provided even more direct testimony. We were told the Americans could not fight in the jungle. We believed this because it had always been true. The British could not. The Dutch could not. Why would Americans be different? But these men, these Marauders, they were not like any Americans we had been told about. They did not need roads. They did not need supply lines. They carried everything they needed, and they kept attacking, kept appearing where we did not expect them. We called them Oni, demons. It was not an exaggeration. By the end, my men were afraid to sleep. They believed the Americans could see in the dark. Lieutenant Yamamoto Kenji, the reconnaissance officer whose diary had chronicled the shifting Japanese perception of the Marauders, was captured during the final assault on Myitkyina. His interrogation, conducted while he was hospitalized for malaria and shrapnel wounds, produced a reflection that captured the totality of the Japanese experience. In 1942, we defeated the British Empire in 69 days. We believed we had proven that Asian soldiers were superior to Western soldiers in jungle warfare. The Marauders proved we were wrong. They were harder than us, more determined than us. They wanted victory more than we did, and they were willing to die for it in ways we did not expect from Americans. I watched my company, 120 men, reduced to 19 in 3 weeks of fighting them, not from air attacks or artillery, from infantry combat, rifle against rifle, bayonet against bayonet. They won. Captain Ogawa Masao, whose diary had documented the 18th Division's journey from contempt to fear, survived the war and published his memoirs in 1968. The book, titled The Jungle We Lost, devoted an entire chapter to the Marauders. Before the Americans came, we believed the jungle was our fortress. We had mastered its secrets. We knew how to move through it, fight in it, survive in it when others could not. The Marauders did not simply match us, they surpassed us. They moved faster, they fought harder, they endured suffering that would have broken Japanese soldiers, and they did it while laughing and cursing and singing songs I could hear through the trees at night. I hated them, I feared them, and when the war ended, I respected them more than any enemy I ever faced. They came into our jungle and they took it from us. That is the truth. Everything else is excuse. The 18th Division, the Chrysanthemum Division, the Conquerors of Singapore, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army, never recovered from its battles with the Marauders. By August 1944, its combat effectiveness had been rated at less than 30%. It spent the remainder of the war in defensive positions, a shadow of the force that had humiliated the British Empire 2 years earlier. The men who broke them had been volunteers, misfits, soldiers who answered a call for a dangerous and hazardous mission without knowing what they would face. They found out, and they won anyway. August 1944, Myitkyina, northern Burma. Colonel Tanaka Shinichi stood in the ruins of what had been the Japanese command post, watching American transport planes land on the airfield his division had been ordered to hold at all costs. The costs had been paid. The airfield had fallen anyway. 6 months earlier, he had stood in a different command tent, reading an intelligence report about American soldiers walking into his jungle. He had smiled. He had called them a gift. He had promised his adjutant that the 18th Division would be collecting dog tags within 3 weeks. The dog tags had been collected. Most of them belonged to Japanese soldiers. Tanaka thought about the men he had lost, the veterans of Malaya and Singapore, the soldiers who had bicycled down a peninsula and broken an empire, the warriors who had never been defeated in jungle combat until they met an enemy that refused to accept defeat. He thought about the reports he had written, each one more desperate than the last, documenting an unraveling he could not stop and could not explain. He thought about the word his men had started using for the Americans, oni, demons, and how he had initially reprimanded them for superstition. He did not reprimand them anymore. The Marauders had done what no Western force had accomplished since Japan began its conquest of Asia. They had met the Imperial Army in the jungle, on terrain the Japanese had mastered, under conditions that favored Japanese doctrine, against soldiers who had never lost. And they had won. Not once, not by accident, repeatedly, systematically, decisively. They had marched 1,000 miles through hell and emerged on the other side still fighting, still killing, still advancing. "We were wrong about them," Tanaka said quietly, to no one in particular. "We were wrong about everything." The 5,307th Composite Unit, Provisional, was officially disbanded on August 10, 1944. The men who could still walk were folded into other units or evacuated for medical treatment that would, in some cases, continue for years. The parasites they carried, the diseases they had contracted, the wounds that had never fully healed, these would follow them home, invisible souvenirs of a campaign that most Americans would never hear about. But their legacy endured. The tactics the Marauders pioneered, long-range penetration, air-supplied infantry operations, small-unit jungle warfare, became the foundation for American Special Operations doctrine. The U.S. Army's 75th Ranger Regiment traces its lineage directly to the 5,307th, carrying forward a tradition born in the Hukong Valley and baptized in blood at Wallabum, Napumga, and Mayitkina. Every Ranger who earns the scroll today inherits something from the men who walked into Burma in February 1944. More than doctrine, the Marauders left behind a truth that the Japanese had believed impossible. American infantry could match any army on Earth in any terrain, under any conditions, if properly trained and properly led. The myth of Western softness, the assumption that had underpinned Japanese strategic thinking since Pearl Harbor, died in the jungles of northern Burma. It was killed by volunteers who had answered a call without knowing where it would lead, who had marched until their boots rotted off their feet, who had fought until their rifles jammed from overuse, and who had won because they simply refused to lose. Colonel Tanaka was repatriated to Japan in 1946. He never spoke publicly about his experiences in Burma, but a letter he wrote to a fellow officer in 1952 was discovered after his death. "I have thought often about the Americans we fought in the Hukong Valley. I have tried to understand how they did what they did. They were sick, outnumbered, far from home, fighting in conditions that should have destroyed them. By every measure we understood, they should have failed. They did not fail. They won. And I have concluded that we did not lose to superior weapons or superior numbers. We lost to superior will. They wanted to win more than we wanted to win. That is a terrible thing to admit, but it is true." In February 1944, a Japanese colonel had read a report about American soldiers entering the Burmese jungle and allowed himself to smile. He had seen Western armies broken before. He had seen the British Empire surrender. He had every reason to believe that history would repeat itself. History did not repeat itself. The men of Merrill's Marauders walked into a jungle that was supposed to destroy them and emerged as conquerors. They faced the finest jungle fighters in the world and proved themselves finer. They were told they could not win, and they won anyway, not through luck, not through technology, but through a ferocity and endurance that the Japanese had believed no Western soldier possessed. They were called demons by an army that had terrified half of Asia. They earned the name.